maybe one point to the Nkrumah Volini, this kind of brutalist grain silo from Ghana where the bats are in. I thought, because it's obviously linked to this kind of post-independence questions, and in preparation we talked a little bit about Nkrumah and also kind of the question of ideology and art, which was so central for kind of Nkrumah's consciousnism and so on and so on. So I would like to start a little bit, if you can elaborate a little bit on the question of kind of art, ideology, what Nkrumah in a way also means for the practice you developed over the last decade.
Well, the interesting thing about, I think Nkrumah was certainly one of the most interesting political figures that we had in the history of Ghana. Certainly that he was one of the people that was very much conscious about what happens, like how people think, like how it shapes their well-being, but mostly thinking about it from a pure ideological position, why people would make choice A versus making choice B, or things like that. Of course, he was a Marxist, so it was very easy for him to come from that position, whereas subsequently, a lot of the political figures that we had, a lot of them didn't really have any clear position anyway, because it was more of a power struggle, whereas Nkrumah was really interested in ways in which we could shift the thinking of the black man, particularly the African, from the subjects of being under a colonial force or enterprise into taking responsibility for their own destiny or things like that, or towards the liberation of others. And I think that's where art became interesting, because even as artists around the world, or even, art is always talking about freedom and independence, emancipation, things like that. But even the tools of contemporary art, honestly, as an artist, I've always found it very disappointing, because when you engage a lot of artists globally, especially artists that are very established, also about their political positions of how they think about the art, about the world from a political point of view, it does not really make much sense, towards, let's say, the progress of, let's say, humankind in general. So the interesting thing about Nkrumah is that most of the things that he was working on, which was never realized, it took time for our generation to be able to inherit these things and then use the subject of philosophy as a time machine to read into it and then to discover all the layers of it. I think those layers came with maybe some of the ideological positions that he himself was thinking about, that at the time it was not possible for those to come into being.
And it was possible, I mean, the title of your talk, the Quagrey effect, and this is kind of like a person, this engineer. And during your talk, I thought, okay, I mean, there was this person, Quagrey, but there were several Quagreys during this kind of time for different projects, different architectural sites, right? So enablers, in a way, who get access to these kind of architectural sites, to this spaces, archives. And maybe this kind of Quagrey as a symbol of collaboration or working together. This was something I thought was very, very interesting, that also the teachers in a way were kind of Quagreys in a way, if you
Of course. Like a lot of my teachers from the art school, I always say that they are the true heroes, because without my teachers from the art school, I don't think I would have become this artist that I am today. Because I even remember back in the day, students, I don't know about here, but even some professors would fail their students because they were selling their painting in a gallery and their students also sold the painting in that same gallery. Or there were certain subjects that they were exploring and they wanted their students to explore those same subjects. And sometimes they would even take some of their students' works and then they would sign their names on it because they wanted their students to be replicas of themselves. Whereas maybe in the generation of caricature, because we've been in a state of crisis and debt for a really long time. So why should we continue making art the same way that we've been making it? Because back in the day, if you made a painting in your house, and then we didn't have cultural institutions. The museum, the only national museum that was being built was built by Nkrumah, and it was abandoned in 1966. So the building was never finished, even till date. And when you go there today, there are squatters living in the building as part of the museum is operating. You know, of course, I think it can be reinterpreted when you're looking at art in an expansive force, but it's not looked at in that sense. But I was just thinking about it from that point of view, that what does it really mean, particularly within our generation, to be able to, for instance, make different choices?
I mean, the whole question of creating, of providing an institution, this is something which is kind of very telling in your work, that it's not only kind of a question of providing the space, giving the space, but also kind of having like an intergenerational gift. One thing, or one last question is, I mean, we are here in a museum. Institutions here, as the museums, are always seen as stable, as of course long-lasting, sustainable, taking care of collections. And maybe it would be interesting to elaborate a little bit on the question of preservation of the collection of your work, or also what means kind of like, what means basically collecting also in the case of SCCA.
Well, the question of collecting, I was trying to invent a different system where artists could, through solidarity, they could exchange works. So for instance, in our generation, we could produce work for, let's say, we could produce works for each other, and we could build different types of institutions around the country which are publicly accessible, where young people can get access to these works. Workshops and all kinds of things could be done in them. I even wrote all these proposals to the government about taking old buildings and producing collections and other things and gifting it to the state. But most of these never come to life because the person who is responsible for the cultural department doesn't understand this to begin with. So how do you begin to even negotiate? So for me, that's why I think that when we're building these, no matter how small, in small forms that we're building this, like either myself or my colleagues. Now in Ghana, there are many different artists who are building like cultural institutions, like Amako Boafo to Kwesi Botwe and many others. What does it mean in the future, especially when a younger generation grows up differently and maybe they become like the ministers of culture one day? What does it mean with regards to, for instance, investing into protecting these legacies? I always think about it sometimes because I always wonder what happens in the next 50 years when you're dead, or maybe next 20 years, because these days you never know. But you also think that there is a sense of faith and belief, because you imagine that you invest in your time into something, implanting a seed, and it's going to yield something in the future. So maybe if that thing is genuine and it's long term, I believe that in the next 20 years, all the children that we're engaging in our activities, they will become different types of citizens in the world, and particularly coming from this context. So they will be the ones to engage in these preservations. Maybe not, but I don't know. But for me, at least, I'm most happy to just experiment, do these things, build these collections, make these artworks, and then put them in these spaces and then see what they become later.
So we will have a microphone coming, and it would be lovely to open the floor and to engage in conversation with you. I think there's one here at the front.
Thank you very much. It was very inspiring to hear you talk and see all the images. And it was, I thought, very nice to see how people were engaging with the artwork, and it seemed to be almost like a collaborative process. And I was thinking, here in Germany or Western Europe, where the consumption of art seems to be so institutionalized, how is it for you to make art in Ghana as opposed to making art for a museum context here, or for a white cube, as you showed some examples?
Well, you can't be too careful about making art. There are different contexts. Again, I grew up studying like Western art forms in art school and all that. But for us, the question was, who is art made for, one, and secondly, how do we engage with this? Either art that is made within the last century, noun, or even like very old cultural forms like archaeological objects. One of the things I didn't talk about was even like there's a lot of archaeological objects dating back to the 5th century in Ghana, which I'm engaging with the towns where a lot of these objects are, in order to be able to rebuild like collections for them, or restituting some of these objects and things like that. So it means something different, particularly what is in those local contexts. Of course, then I can understand here how, like within the West, how art has been engaged in, particularly within the last decades. But it's also interesting, you learn quite a lot from it with regards to how, like some of the decisions that are made around installations and all that. Because again, in Ghana, we need to learn some of those things in order to be able to understand the works that was made by our predecessors, the older artists, because we are trying to restore their legacies also through these forms. So for me, I learn a lot quite from here. But with regards to my personal work and what I want to do with it and how I want to see people engage with it back at home, I would make different choices. But when I come here also, I would make choices that somehow also, sometimes, yeah, they work in relation to the context. Because sometimes in trying to be too radical, it doesn't also work. It becomes a bit weird and strange. Yeah. Yeah, that's the question.
Two questions at the back.
And that was a really amazing talk, super inspirational to hear everything you're doing in Ghana. I kind of want to add to that question, or flip it upside down, because today at the Kunstszene we talked a little bit about the non-aligned movement, and then I'm actually more interested in hearing more about how you, in your practice, working in other cultural contexts in the Global South, and I know you were speaking today about working in Bangladesh, and if there's any plans for cross-cultural collaboration with other spaces in other countries, even in the surrounding area like Burkina Faso, if there's any plans for SCCA and Red Clay to have that kind of collaboration too, that there be an intercultural collaboration outside of Europe. Let's forget about the West for a second.
Yeah, no, certainly, why not? I've done quite some work in Congo twice, in Lusanga and others, and I've also done some work in South Africa, other places. The last 2 times I did some collaborations in Congo, I asked them to keep the work. I went to produce these large-scale installations. So I even produced them in Ghana, sent them for an installation, but I gifted the work to them. Of course, we've had like collaborations between different institutions. The Africa Artists Foundation, AF, in Lagos with Azu. We did an exhibition last year, Dig Where You Stand, which we had different works by different artists that were shown in the exhibition, and each place the exhibition is traveling across different institutions, and each time it goes to a different institution, they leave one work behind, and then they produce new works, and then it travels. Yeah, so there are quite a number of, and even this year I offered a residency to an artist in Bangladesh when I went for the Dakar Summit. Yeah, so the idea is basically, honestly, I wish that I could travel to as many different places and do the kind of work that I do, because for me, that's where I find joy in, to be able to build things from scratch, or to be able to see how we can work with existing systems and all that. And there are a lot of institutions out there. Sometimes the problem is that some of these institutions, they might not share the same political points that you do, but it's just a matter of negotiating. And I'm still trying to understand and learn that. So we'll try and do that as much as we can across. But there are so many institutions that we're talking with. What's the name? 32 Degrees East in Uganda, Michael Amiche's space in Nairobi, in Kai, and many others. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your wonderful explanation behind your practice. I want to ask 2 questions, please. They lead on to one another. So my name is Ijaka, and I'm a Kenyan artist, and I'm here on a guest lectureship at the Half-Bika. My first question, coming from someone who understands a context of how the continent works, how do the established institutions within Ghana react to your institution in terms of how do you interact? Do they engage you? Do they engage your programs? Basically, how is the interaction between the established institutions, museums especially, and your center?
Institutions, do you mean like political institutions or cultural?
No, cultural institutions. Museums in general, the larger museums in Accra.
The main museum we had in Ghana was the National Museum. And that's very different. Of course, in the beginning, we've engaged with them on different levels. So for instance, in 2015, our department, the painting department, we organized an exhibition, Cornfields in Accra, Oddly Disorderly, and one other exhibition, The Gown Must Go to Town. Yes, we did a trilogy of exhibition in the Science and Technology Museum, which was not finished. And then we invested money into like building walls and other things to do these exhibitions in. Of course, even a few years later, I requested a loan of some objects. The Apollo mission, there were some rocks from the moon that were brought. And at the time, the Americans made these gifts where they crystallized some of the rocks and they gave it to countries. Ghana was one of those because we also like engaged in space exploration in the 80s. Ghana, our first president Nkrumah was married to an Egyptian, Fatia. So Egypt gifted us a sarcophagus which had this mummy in it, and I needed that mummy for an exhibition in Tamale together with their coffin, and they gave it to us. But it's difficult as individual, like there are people within the institution that you can work with, but as an institution in itself, there are a lot of problems with it, you know, things. So it's an antagonistic, sometimes it's like a bit of an antagonistic relationship going back and forth. But there are people in there that would come to, for instance, to Tamale for workshops, they'll come and do things. But there are a lot of them also who just don't want to see anything happen because they think that maybe the form that the National Gallery is in has to be left that way. Whereas we're trying to push them to be able to think differently about the role of art within the state and all that.
Thank you very much. So now that answer leads me to the next question. So now the other day I was having a conversation with one of the research assistants at the school, and we were talking around this subject of restitution of objects from the institutions here back home. And my argument was that I believe that the institutions here are doing a good job of the documentation of these artifacts or objects in the first place, as we, on our side, should be doing the preparation for the reception of these objects. And my argument was that I don't think that we are ready to receive quite a number of these things. And why do I think so? It's basically your answer. You understand? Your answer around are local institutions putting in place what you've shown us? Are they creating narratives for young people to start to understand what was lost in between that period, you know, around where those objects were lost, such and such things? I want to know your view on how you see restitution of objects that were Ghanaian owned, how much faith you have in the institutions that exist on the ground that are supposed to receive these objects. If you could kindly talk about your views on this.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's always an interesting one, but clearly I have my view on it. Yeah, of course, my point of restitution comes in many different forms, not just in relation to the objects, but also in relation to the idea of courage, even in itself. A lot of young people don't even have this to begin with, particularly even when it comes to like thinking about cultural phenomena, things like that. I always thought that infrastructure was one of the most important things for us to invest, at least within our generation, into. And then infrastructure, not just the human infrastructure, but also like intellectual infrastructure. You need young people who understand the cultural significance of these objects. So that's what we try to do within our institution. That's why we bring the students to witness the building of these things. So one day when they're talking to their children, like, I was there when they were building these things. Oh, I remember the day when they were laying this brick. It's more important to them with regards to preserving it and things like that. Whereas politically, there are a lot of people in within the cultural department or in Africa saying, oh, but just the Europeans should give us. Of course, I understand these objects should be returned back home. But Europe also needs to understand that over the years, there have been many forms of extraction from the global south and others. They also need to invest money into building these institutions, because at the end of the day, it's a human, now we've gotten to a point where it's a human, it's a human history that we're dealing with. Of course, Germany and France and many other places still hold these objects, but then it's important that they go back to Africa, but it's not just that when they're in Africa, they're there. Some of the objects can still be here. I don't totally agree with the fact that all the objects need to be returned. I think that at some point, it's now a shared history that we all have. Like, there are young people who are here who need to learn about these things. How do we build institutions that, in different geographical contexts, that can bridge these gaps? The children who are in Africa can be able to understand these things and relate to them the same way that institutions from here can do that. There are a lot of young people on the continent who can come here on like scholarships to learn about preservation, blah, 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 whilst these institutions are being built. But I also think that the form that the institution takes, like particularly from ethnographic positions, have to change. Because a lot of these objects, when they were taken, they were not within that ethnographic sense. And we really have to think about forms of display and even like the material forms and how we reinterpret these things in relation even to contemporary gestures and all that. So it's quite a complicated one. Very simple, but it requires some kind of, I guess, what's the name? Mutual dialogue and understanding, yeah, from an intellectual position to be able to get some of these things done. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer, because I was really curious about your perspective. I'm sorry if I'm taking too much space. I was very curious because this argument is hard to have from an African perspective. As an African, it's a really hard argument to make because there's a sort of a gang culture around we must be against the white person. You know, we must get back what was ours without contextualizing, like, I mean, what is going to happen when these things come back? How are they going to be taken care of? How do they help bridging the gap that was lost, you know? So I'm very glad that, and you know, it's very telling that young practitioners should be the ones to think or to be solving these answers. You mentioned Michael Armitage from Nairobi, from home. The younger practitioners are the people who are thinking, or who we have faith in to receive these objects. I would prefer than a museum in Accra that you receive those objects, because you seem to have a working plan of how this knowledge can be disseminated, you know, out and wide, rather than our institutions and their neo-colonial way of doing the museum work. This is sort of the way they hold these things, and you find that young people cannot even access them. No one accesses museums at home. They're not spaces that people walk into. So are these people ready to put down the programming to have people visit and see these things that were apparently lost of our identity? So this sort of...
Yeah, there was a case of the sarcophagus that had the mummy in it. And years down the line, the only thing that exists of the mummy now is the head of the mummy, because parts of the mummy was robbed over years in the museum. Yeah, so again, back again to that question, that if we are, for me, that's why I think that it's important investing into a generation that understands these, the significance of these. It will take quite a long time. It's not just a matter of making a structure. There are many things that are going to lead to the preservation of these things in the future. And you have to build that into like a code. It's like a code that you have to build into a generation, so that one day, when they are taking responsibility for these things, the choices that they make around them and how they reinterpret and redistribute them, it will be something different. So it's a valid point. But again, people are very passionate and emotional about these subjects. So each time it comes up, there's a lot of tension here and there. Yeah.
There was one question there and then over there. Yeah.
Where was the question exactly?
No, I think, was it? Okay, then we start here. Okay, sorry.
Did you have a question?
I said, yeah.
Ich hoffe, das ist okay, wenn ich in meiner Muttersprache rede und das jemand übersetzt.
Okay, ja.
Okay, also zum einen erstmal vielen Dank für diesen Vortrag, der mich sehr fasziniert hat. Genauso wie mein Besuch letztes Jahr in Tamale, als ich wegen Ihres Projektes dort war. Wunderbar, ich bin richtig begeistert.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. And he was in Tamale last year to visit your space, and yeah, it was very thought-provoking and interesting.
Sehr beeindruckt hat mich die Kombination und aus meiner Sicht die sehr lässige, angenehm lässige Kombination Geschichte, Politik und moderne Kunst, also zusammenzubringen, zu zeigen. Und ich glaube, dass das auch das Rezept ist, dass die Leute, ich habe 2 Tage das beobachtet, die Leute tatsächlich dort einen Weg zur Kunst kriegen. Und zwar nicht einfach nur, ich gucke mir ein Bild an und gehe wieder raus, sondern richtig sich mit Kunst auseinandersetzen. Ältere als auch viele Kinder, auf die sich ja bezogen hat.
So he was there for 2 days, and he saw a lot of young people, old people, and a very easy way in engaging politics, history, art, contemporary art.
Yeah,
contemporary art, and for him it was kind of a very good way in engaging different generations and the public.
Ja, ist okay. Ich könnte jetzt noch viel erzählen, aber ja, okay. Aber es hat
the question maybe, die Frage.
Nein, wie gesagt, ich habe 2017, glaube ich, auf der Documenta von diesem Projekt gehört, habe sofort auf Facebook diesen Mann verfolgt, wenn ich das mal so sagen darf.
2017 he saw your work at Documenta and then basically followed you on social media.
Genau, und ich bin einfach fasziniert von der Idee und auch von der Umsetzung und auch erstaunt, dass es tatsächlich Künstler gibt, die er scheint ja auch Marxist zu sein, wenn ich die Bibliothek dort im Center richtig interpretiert habe. Aber auch die Umsetzung von Theorie halt in Praxis, nämlich dass da, so habe ich es verstanden, auch alles offen ist. Alles offen.
Yeah, okay, so it's everything is open, and the link between kind of theory and practice, and he seems to be, maybe you're also a Marxist, but yeah. And because of your library, he thought that you have kind of like also Marxist background or so, and yeah, what was, so is it coming like a question? Okay, but it was more like a comment. Okay, but I think it was very supportive, and he was very amazed by your work.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
So. Yes, thank you very much for your talk. And when I see this picture behind, I'm very impressed of this space and seeing all these huge objects, trains and also aeroplanes. So I'm very curious how this could be financed, everything. And the second is what I saw, the pictures that you showed. There are so many people, school classes and other people. How do you organize that these people come there? And I don't know, where is it, far from Tamale, or where is it exactly situated? Is in the countryside. So I would like you to talk a little bit about this.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. It's rather a very simple one. It's it's financed from my work. So traveling to give a lecture like this. So part of the money goes into the so for instance the fee that I'm being paid now to do this talk, it's more than enough to do, let's say, 10 workshops in a space. So I think about it in that sense. So of course I'm selling my labor, but using the residue of it in order to be able to fund the institution, or the installations that I produce, which are sold to museums around the world. I would use that money to build the institution. it was very important as a political position as an artist, especially coming from this Marxist background, that I use the residue of the capital in order to be able to build the institution to begin with. So for instance, the sacks are used to transport cocoa, and globally, cocoa produces almost $300 billion every year. But Ghana and Ivory Coast, that produces 70% of the world's cocoa, only makes about $3 billion from it. So it means that every year, there is almost $290-something billion that is running around in excess capital, surplus capital, and then they fund NGOs that come back to Ghana, Ivory Coast, others, and then they teach farmers about contraception, blah, blah, blah. There are so many ridiculous contradictions within the global system, you know. So, of course, those systems can never build the types of institutions that can open up, let's say, the ideas of freedom among a growing generation. But it's interesting that when the sack becomes a worn-out thing, dead, and then it no longer has its value, through art, it can produce, let's say, an institution like this. It's a contradiction, you know? So I'm really interested in that point, that the dead object can even create life than something living that produces, let's say, billions. So it's not a money thing. It's more or less about really following an object and then trying to understand what it does and what it can produce away from the excessism of capitalism and all that. And the other question was the schools, how do we bring them to the space? Yeah, we write a lot of letters, honestly, to like the Metropolitan Assembly. They give us the permits to engage, to bring the kids to the institution. Sometimes the kids, they come on their own. If the school wants to come on their own because we're doing an exhibition and we have a program and we send it to them, that's something different. But if we have a program and we want to bring them, we have to organize the buses and everything, and we have to write to them. And once they approve it, they give us someone from the assembly who will every day go with the bus to the school and bring the students. But we always select schools that are out of the metropolitan, like from areas where they can easily, because some of the schools are private and their parents have money to pay for them to take buses. But some of the kids, they come from very poor communities where even access to food is even a problem. So I'm always interested in ways in which, in the process of engaging them in a workshop, we can also tackle some of these things regarding basic things like food or whatever at the same time. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I would like to ask you something about tokenism. I was wondering, when you present your work in the so-called, I guess, global north, do you find yourself being tokenized by, I think, your audience, I guess? Yeah, can you maybe draw your stake on that?
Yeah, I guess you can't escape that, honestly. Yeah, you can't. The ideas that we work with as artists or cultural practitioners, I don't think would ever be understood fully in terms of what they are, the significance, the full significance of it is. Because most often you get invited to projects and you know that maybe the institution doesn't fully understand it. They just want what it represents or the idea of it. But then again, you also do it. Like sometimes I do it, like I deliberately just do it because I can. And I just leave it at that, because at the end of the day, you're also building a history as part of the work that you're doing. Because imagine that there are a lot of artists from the global south, though we are doing exhibitions and projects elsewhere, but those things have to travel. It's almost impossible for a lot of artists in the global south to be given visas and other things to come here to begin with. So if you end up having the opportunity to do that, there is something that you can learn from it. For me, it's not so much about what people think, it's more of what you learn in the process when you are engaging with that. Because recently when I installed the work in Venice, the Parliament of Ghosts, as part of the Architecture Biennale, there was so much that I was learning basically by just being within the space and trying to understand ways of producing the work within that context, you know. after experimenting with the parliament in its full form in Ghana and thinking about ways in which we could rebuild it in different contexts and all that, one might think at some point, people say, but why would you do these exhibitions? Because it doesn't really bring the work to its full potential. Well, I'm like, yes, but it doesn't really matter. There is something else that you're going to learn within that process that can help, not just you, but will be an example for other artists, younger artists in the future. Yeah. There was someone here.
Was there a question here in the... I missed?
Hey, gentleman.
My friend here says that it seems like I'm attacking you, but I would just like to know, following up on the gentleman's question, I actually was almost going to ask the same question, but I know how it can be a sensitive subject. And you can feel free not to want to answer. And it's definitely an amazing center, and you say that you fund it off your own practice. But are there any other organizations that you engage to assist with operating the center, or maybe acquiring aspects of the center?
No.
No. Oh, okay.
Not at all.
Wow.
As I said, I started building, it was a personal project. I started building this space as a home. I live here. So when I have children one day, they're going to grow up in this environment. Like, it's a personal thing I was building. But I was really interested in ways in which you can build, because there are artist studios, and I don't like this idea of the artist studio as a factory where you make paintings, you make the same thing again because they are successful. I was really interested in the experimental value of the institution. So even I would negotiate, when I started building the space, the land I originally acquired was 2 acres of land for the project, but now it's about 200 acres of land because I had to negotiate with my neighbors and then talk to them. Some of them have started building homes there, and I spoke to them about ways in which I wanted to expand the institution. So sometimes even around the village, areas where there wasn't, because when I went there, no one had built anything. It was just a farmland, forest and everything. And when I started building, suddenly, because there was no water, there was no electricity or anything there, because of course, the government never really does those things, you know. So I paid the electricity company, and then we connected the electricity to the place, and then I paid the water company, we connected the water to the place, and all that. So people started to think that, oh, there's life there, let's move out of the city and let's go and live in this area. And I say, hey, hold on, like, I don't want so much disturbance because we need space to expand in the future. But like trying to negotiate, talking to my neighbors, and they said, oh, sure, we understand that one day you might want to do this and that, so maybe, what if on the other side of the village, you could buy the land and then move us. So there was a lot of negotiation that had to take place. So now I'm thinking, because a lot of the people who are interested in these institutions, they don't really understand this kind of, if you're coming from this Marxist background that we're coming, sometimes it's just militant positions. Like people come to the institution and they get annoyed. They're like, oh, but why don't we have to pay? At least people have to pay something. Or like even recently, we had the European Union coming to they were funding these musicians to do like music, like pedagogical workshops, like around music, things like that. And they said, oh, but we want to pay to use the institution, we want to be associated. And I said, no, you don't have to pay anything. Just come and then work with these musicians, but put the money into their program. Make sure you pay them well enough to be able to do this and feel comfortable. And then people are like, oh, but this doesn't make sense. But the EU, they have money. And I said, yes, I know. The whole point is that you are building an institution that is for everyone. It doesn't really matter whether someone has money or someone doesn't have money. The point is that you're trying to build a gift. When you're giving someone a gift, you're doing it unconditionally. It's like love. You're not expecting anything in return. So whether it works out or it doesn't work out, it doesn't really matter. But the most important thing is that at least we are engaged in some kind of a mutual respect of understanding or trying to build something. Yeah, so that's why I don't engage institutions on that capital front. Maybe one day it will change. But for now, whilst it's still young, it's also a good example for younger people to understand that when you are on the continent and maybe the conditions that you find are dire and they are difficult. We don't have access to electricity, water, blah, blah, blah. And you're coming from a poor community or whatever, it's still possible for you to, through the sweat of your labor, regardless of how precarious it is. Because I could have lived anywhere else in the world, honestly, in these last 8 years. But it's just 8 years of work, of building this institute. 8 years ago, none of this existed. All the things I'm talking about, they didn't exist. But if this is possible in 8 years, imagine what is possible in the next 100 years. And it comes back to your question again regarding the restitution. We need to be able to do it over a long term in collaboration with others. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. Thank you so much to you for being here. And yeah.